Welcome to the Confident Defense Podcast. I'm your host, Connor Sherman, and today we have a guest I am especially excited to be talking with, Robert Vail. He's the Director of Security for Citrine Informatics, and he and I were on a panel together not too long ago talking about what the disruption of COVID has had on the technology companies overall, how to secure people as they're working from home. And in that conversation, we just found that there was more to be unpacked than we had time for. So this is kind of the part two of that conversation. Well, Bob, thank you so much for being here and welcome to the show.
I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So Bob, one of the things that we discussed and just totally got my imagination fired up when we were last talking was that you started your security journey becoming a CISO by being a helicopter pilot. Like, how does a guy go from like being a professional helicopter pilot all the way up to being both taking CIO roles where you're the top of the .com space, or moving now into being a head of, or not moving now, we've been there for a while now, but like a head of security at multiple companies. So how does a guy go from like point A to point B? Walk us through that background. It's fascinating.
Certainly. So my passion for flying began when I was pretty young, actually. Being a first-time pilot, I was working for a helicopter airline in Southern California. Got to know the chief pilot there pretty well, and he kind of spurred my interest. I took my first demonstration ride, I believe it was in May of 1983, and I was hooked from the first 5 minutes at the controls. So pursued that as I was able to afford it, and eventually got my commercial pilot and flight instructor ratings, did some teaching, all kinds of interesting flying work, which I described to my friends as the most fun you can have with your clothes on. It is a tremendously interesting skill set to have. I was very fortunate to be tutored and to work with some giants in the aviation industry, and in particular around television and movies. I got an opportunity to do some really interesting work, and eventually tried to pursue a law enforcement career to get a civil service job to actually make a decent living flying a helicopter. As much fun as that job is, it's not a great money-making career in the grand scheme of things. The transition to that, to a technical career is actually kind of an interesting bit. I know several pilots who I had a very similar career path with. One in particular who we were both originally musicians. He was a pianist and I was a tenor. And realized we couldn't make any money in the music business either, became pilots, and then realized that wasn't actually the most lucrative profession as well. And we both ended up going into technical things. So I have a feeling, I don't have any scientific data to support it, but I have a feeling that these are all kind of left brain activities, and the technical skill of piloting an aircraft and understanding the regulations and all of the various collections of information you have to be able to consume are very similar in a lot of ways to technical careers. When I was in my late 20s, early 30s, I went back to school and got a degree in electronics and started working in robotics and telecom and lots of other interesting kind of computer-based things, and got my start in the .com era working for a small company that was called OneView Networks. This was a group of folks that built an interface for online banking. Included the ability to buy and sell stock and pay your bills from a single view, therefore the name OneView Network. That company was then acquired by Digital Insight, which was an internet banking company that did aggregation and back-end services for thousands of small credit unions and banks, farm co-ops, those kind of things.
Right.
Then from there, I actually got into working for Fisher Investments in the wealth management space, and spent 10 years basically honing my craft in an amazing company that when I joined was about 200 people, and somewhere in the neighborhood of $8 billion under management.
Yeah.
Last year, I got news that they were now 100+ billion under management and have offices all over the world. So I think it's really a reasonable path that becomes apparent as you take the steps.
Yes.
It's not really, I would love to say I had a master plan to move from one to the next, but it's honestly just the things that interest me and that I've taken the time to learn and hone my craft.
Yeah, I mean, that seems to be the way of life, right? There is nobody who starts out in school and says, okay, here's the plan. Musician, pilot, technology engineer, running IT, head of security. Like that doesn't happen, right? But
No,
there is an organic sense of like, hey, you just keep that eyes open and follow your passion.
Yeah, if they'd put that on the aptitude test when I was in high school, I don't think I would have checked those boxes even then. So
Exactly. No, but I could imagine, this is me maybe taking a bit of a stretch or a bit of a reach, but when you're flying a plane or flying a helicopter, something like that, where it's like you're at the controls, you're making decisions, you make the wrong decision, and the consequences are rather grave. That does kind of remind me of being a head of security for a tech company. So
absolutely,
it's like, where's my attention and where am I prioritizing it?
agreed. And I love the phrase. I learned this one from a colleague of mine many years ago, that the ability to remain calm in a stressful situation is a skill that is common, in particular with pilots. Having had a couple of actual emergency landings that I had to make, you start shaking after it's over. You rely on your procedures, you remain calm, you do what you're supposed to do to solve the situation. The primary difference between flying and information security issues and other technical problems you have in IT is that in IT nobody dies.
Right. There's a very big difference between that one. Unless you're like in critical infrastructure or hospitals or something.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And then in that case, there.
But I like that phrase, shake when it's over.
Yeah.
Right. Right now, just follow the process, get to the end.
That's right.
I just have that kind of split brain. So like, yeah, I know this is bad, but we'll get to the feelings later. We have to stick in the thinking place right now.
Precisely. Yeah.
But that's amazing. So for someone who's come and had such a varied career as you've come into being the head of security, the director of security at this current place, like I also noticed that along the way, you did a bit of a pit stop, if I can call it that, like with Security for Charities. This was an organization that you were involved with and still are involved with. I just love the concept, based on what I was able to research about this, of just being able to take security talent and take this with really expensive talent and bring it to places of need. I just thought it was a fascinating thing. If you wouldn't mind, could you just unpack kind of like what drew you to Security for Charities, kind of what got you going with that? I'd love to learn more about it.
Certainly. I cannot take credit for the idea for the company. My mentor and friend, Dr. Ken Baylor, who is a tremendous security professional and has a long and excellent career in the business, it was his brainchild. And essentially, he wanted to start a charity that would take advantage of our expertise in information security in such a way that it would benefit other charities. So the basic idea of the organization was to attract volunteer security professionals to help small charities to secure their systems. So one of the big things about charities is if you have to write them a check, there's a limited number of people that will go ahead and do that, especially these days. So if a charity wants to get into taking electronic payment forms, whether that's credit card or even simple things like wire transfer, there is a number of things that we all in security understand that you have to do correctly to secure those organizations. And in most cases, that is not an inexpensive process.
Yeah.
The idea of Securities for Charities was to get professionals who have expertise in these areas to volunteer their time to assist these other charities in securing their environments, which would enable them to increase their methods of funding in particular. And also in terms of certain types of charities, they can, especially under the new HIPAA regulations, and I say new because when we formed it, they were getting going. There is data that if, for example, you're in a breast cancer awareness or ovarian cancer awareness organization, you may inadvertently start collecting things that would be in HIPAA. And so again, the idea being that having people who are expert in these fields, giving of themselves, offering their time to help secure these organizations, allowed these charities to be more successful. Ken is also able to, he's a very brilliant man, and he's been able to get some funding to help support this idea. And as much as I enjoyed doing the work, I have to give the 99% of the credit to Ken Baylor.
That's fair. That's fair. I think it's a fascinating and fantastic idea. I mean, we talk about innovation on the show a lot, in how we can bring technology to solve problems. We can move faster. We can put guardrails in place. We can help people achieve their particular objectives inside commercial organizations. But there are two other spaces that really get neglected by the security industry, and that is consumers, direct consumer technology, right? It's still a disaster, being able to like personal privacy and personal data. And then the other one is charities. Because it's just expensive. Like it's like security is a premium product in the grand scheme of things. So
absolutely.
And so I'm glad there's people like Ken out there in the world who are championing a democratization of it, or at least an accessibility of security talent like that. That was awesome. So what we'll do is, just for all the listeners who might be interested in this on the show, we'll add that to the show notes. We'll add some links in there, just if anyone wants to give Security for Charities a look and see if they want to spend some time there. It sounds like it'd be well worth the exploration for sure.
Absolutely.
Now, because we are in the middle of the year that we are in, there's no way I can let you go without talking about what's happening to our little precious corporate world that's getting got kicked really hard in February, March, when COVID came around. And all of a sudden the security industry was like, whoa, we need to transform. We need to adapt. We need to make big changes to support and secure a company that's going through huge transformation. So what I want to do was, and it's okay if we repeat some of the same content we had in our last conversation here, because the audience is going to love the ability for us to go deeper into that. Mm-hmm. But I think just talking about some of the things, just COVID transitions, we've had the remote workforce was one thing that a lot of people have struggled with, or like certainly for like March, April, May, big initiatives, get people working from home for the first time. I think a lot of startups, or not necessarily startups, just kind of a lot of newer generation companies didn't struggle with that, because they were like, hey, that MacBook we gave you works just as well at home. Head on over, and it's like, okay, your Google app still works. Your GitHub is still hosted as a SaaS service and such. So I know that like the VPN story has been kind of told a lot, but you and I really kind of start digging into like protecting SaaS and doing that well. And I'd like to just get your thoughts and kind of unpack that for us. Like, as a security leader or as an executive in a company who's thinking about, hey, great news, we have all this stuff up in Box, we have all this stuff in Google Drive, people can work from home, they can do those things. How do we start to protecting it well? Like, what are some of the risks? What are some of the mental models or frameworks for understanding how to protect this data well as it relates to the business? Like, I'd love to get your opinions on that.
Great set of topics there. I would like to start by saying that you make a good point that the newer companies that are less bound to on-prem solutions were already in a better place to deal with something like enforced work from home. What we have discovered as kind of being told to go home and work is that a lot of the assumptions that we made, or even accepted norms of, we had to have meetings in person, we had to occupy a conference room, we had to do all of those things in person and draw on whiteboards and do that kind of thing, it has just proven to be adaptable rather than hard and fast things. And so companies that are in the idea that as the shift has occurred to a SaaS-based compute, and I should also include PaaS and some other technologies that also are in that same basic idea, that instead of operating a data center on your own premise with your own people, perhaps multiple data centers where you have responsibilities for data transfers and duplication and disaster recovery and business continuity, all of those things back in the old days, we were building iron servers. We were building things literally from scratch and installing operating systems and connecting all of our pieces together and taking tape
The
backups.
console cable was a thing,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Our technology was, in physical terms, was absolutely necessary.
Yeah.
And in the current world we live in, my personal view, and I hear arguments on both sides of this, is that I can't see how, especially a mid-size or an SMB, can possibly operate a data center as securely and efficiently as an Amazon can. To me, it just is a no-brainer that it doesn't relieve us of all of the security responsibilities and, frankly, IT configuration and IAM and the rest of those bits and pieces. But it does mean that we're removing the idea that we all have to operate our own iron.
Yeah.
We just don't. And I think what is very interesting about Citrine Informatics, where I'm working now, is this is a SaaS first, last, and only company. As what's interesting about that is not only have we embraced the technology and adopted a great majority, we've adopted everything one way or another. We're not operating a data center for any reason. We have some office locations where we have networking equipment to get connected to things, but at the end of the day, we're using SaaS providers for, you name it. It's the services that we use, Office 365 and file storage and you name it. All of those services, HR, all of those things are all hosted as a service to us. Again, it doesn't relieve us of all of the security information issues that we have, nor does it mean that you can just trust in the Lord and sign up for anybody out there. You still have diligence to do. And I think that in terms of living in a SaaS-centric environment, that those bits and pieces of that, what we refer to as the shared responsibility, are critical to understanding how to do that correctly. If you adopt those procedures and policies and are diligent about your vendor management and vetting for the things that you need to do so that you're compliant with things like GDPR and CCPA, et cetera, it's a governance, risk, and compliance exercise rather than an IT infrastructure exercise. And so there's a lot of ability for companies to save money. As it relates to the pandemic, being a SaaS-first company meant for Citrine Informatics and the idea of here's your Mac laptop, go ahead and use it at home. You've made a very good point there. The transition to we can't come to the office anymore, so we all need to work from home was, okay, let's go do that. Yeah. Very interesting other kind of sideline, just as a note to explain one of the benefits, if you can call it that, of a pandemic, in this case, at least for Citrine, was that we needed to do a yearly exercise in our BCDR program.
Yes.
And a part of the BCDR, of course, is a pandemic response. If you didn't have one before this, I guarantee you have one now. And for us, the pandemic response included isolation, working from home, remote work, video conferencing rather than in-person meetings, and the rest of those things. For Citrine Informatics, it was, okay, get on with it. As a matter of fact, when I joined the firm, it was the day that the Bay Area counties said everyone needs to go home, and I onboarded and have had my entire work experience with this company remotely.
That's amazing.
How's that been? It's fantastic. I have been to the office on a couple of occasions for housekeeping duties and to retrieve personal items for people and those kind of things, but I don't actually have a desk there. And I don't need one at this point. And so for me, it was, I've been traditionally in finance and banking and wealth management and insurance. And these traditional brick and mortar businesses, you're expected to show up every day. And, in many cases, you have an office that you kind of have to yourself if you're in management. And in some cases, not. For example, Fisher Investments, when I worked there, there were only 2 people in the entire firm that had offices. One was the founder, which, okay, that makes sense. And the other was an attorney. And the rest of them, including CFO, CTO, all of the C-level people, sat in open areas with the rest of the people working there. And it was a great environment. It was conducive. However, in a pandemic, you can't do that. So
that's like the worst thing to do at a pandemic.
Yeah. Right, exactly. I will say that as we have adjusted to this, I think companies that were convinced that they could never do it have had to adapt. And for example, I know of a couple of organizations where they've polled their employees to say when we can return to the office, how many of you people would like to do that? And the results of several of those surveys are in the teens to low single digits.
Yeah.
It has become a comfortable thing for us. And to be fair, the environment is getting a break from lots of us not commuting. The out-of-pocket costs that go with driving a car and crossing a bridge and all of the vagaries of gasoline and tires and all those things, we're just not paying that money anymore. And there's a benefit to all of us from doing that, and also to the environment, as I said. But ultimately, I think this is a very healthy transition for all of us. You know, I've heard arguments to say, well, we all need to socialize. To be fair, I think our Citrine Informatics does an excellent job of that. We do weekly social engagements within the company via Zoom and Slack and other methods where we actually have done things like we had a cooking contest the other day where we divided into teams and we made pizza remotely. So like a cutthroat kitchen kind of a thing. I think it's possible to adapt to all of those things that we need as business, but you know, it takes a little bit of creativity.
Couldn't agree more. And I think that creativity is the one thing that's going to like help us win during this, because it is different, right? That people are not infinitely elastic. There's a sense of like, this is a shock to the system. You got to help people get through it. A lot of companies had a lot of turnover because of it. And so I think some people like less the companies they were working at, not because there was anything materially wrong, but they just needed a cathartic, like, hey, this change was forced on me. Now I'm going to voluntarily make a change, like kind of a this for that type of situation.
Absolutely. At one of the firms I worked at, actually, there was there were several groups actually that were prohibited from working at home. There was some flexibility in some groups. There was zero flexibility in other groups. And that was a bit of contention with some of the employees that were in a position where they couldn't work from home ever for any reason. Mm-hmm. So they would end up taking PTO to do things that they had to stay with a sick kid or those kind of things. The company not only lost their productivity, but this was a bone of contention as they were talking about what they'd like to see the company do. And that decision got made for the companies rather than landing with them to say, no, we're not going to allow you to do that. They were like, yes, now you have to go home. So it's a good point that circumstance has dictated a lot of things we've had to adjust to.
Yeah, and I think that culture of I think that phrase was put nicely, that enforced work from home. It's like, it really is. You didn't have much of a choice. And so now adapt. And that is the hallmark of any great company right now, is they are adapting and changing.
Absolutely.
There was something you mentioned a little earlier I want to circle back on. We're talking about SaaS services. Mm-hmm. So, we're in a world where the most precious things that we own are on somebody else's computer, right? Mm-hmm. So we're all running things in AWS, or most of us running things in AWS, GCP, Azure. We've got Git repository sitting on GitHub, GitLab, so on and so forth.
Correct.
And we're like, great. So we're trusting these vendors to do a great job with their security and also give us the appropriate knobs and dials to secure our view into that data set. And you mentioned third-party risk management. So I want to unpack that for a little bit. Mm-hmm. Like, if someone is trying to get their hands around the value of third-party risk management, if they're trying to say, what are the key questions they should dive into? Where's the areas to focus on? Like, let's unpack that for people. We talk about the shared responsibility. What's our side of that responsibility?
AWS is actually a tremendous example of this. Early on, people used to say, we're absolutely secure, we're at AWS.
Right. We both know that's a false statement in itself, yes.
Okay. The shared responsibility piece of that what you have to realize is AWS does some things exceptionally well. They have level 5 data centers that are secured as tight as anything the DoD or anybody else is doing.
In fact, the DoD uses those data centers.
Right?
Exactly.
Exactly. Yeah, there's a lot of capability that they can provide. At the end of the day, however, you are still responsible for configuring your own machines and your own VPC connectivity and your firewalls and your IAM. And there's all of this stuff that you have to do, whether it's your machine running at your desk or a virtual machine that elastically grows and contracts under load at AWS. The truth is, what we have to do as security professionals isn't going to change completely. The IT piece, I think, is really where the greatest impact is. But from an information security perspective, that idea that you have to do all of the things that you did on-prem differently. So I would say two things are critically important. One is that you have a system that allows you to concatenate all of those interesting things that you learn from your SaaS providers. And by that, I mean, Cloud App Security from Microsoft is a good example. There's a number of other ones. I just happen to know that one particularly well. It allows you to use a CASB, a Cloud Application Security Broker, to attach to your SaaS providers. And depending on the sophistication of that provider and or the CASB that you're using, you get visibility into what's actually going on, and in some cases, better than we ever did on-prem.
Yes, I agree with that wholeheartedly. I sorry to interrupt. I want you to finish that thought, but like this sentence, this idea that somehow we're in a, like, I think all security professionals should say, thank God we have cloud. Like, right? Finally, we have API access to all the bits that matter. We have a standardized infrastructure that we can have scalable detections and protective controls on. Yes, I think for the first time, we're almost in a winning position because of it. Well, we're in a more winning position to deal with those risks.
Absolutely. Well, I'll give you one of my favorite examples because it was one of the early nightmares I had in my career in security. And that was to take the entire concept of 60 or so departmental file servers and inventory the files and folders and the permissions and the people, and oh my God, it became an untenable problem because at the time we didn't really have a tool for this. So we invented things like enormous spreadsheets that would reach 65,000 rows, and then you'd have spreadsheet B because you had run out of space. In that environment, trying to keep up with change control and roles and responsibilities and rights and permissions, and oh my God, it was completely untenable. Whereas in the cloud, I'll give you an example. Box is one of my favorite examples. Using the proper CASB attached to Box, I can get alerted on everything that changes. I can see when a user invites someone to a folder. I can see when a folder has a file within it deleted. I can see entire categories of information. So I can do a file labeling or naming convention that through the CASB allows me to pull reports on all of the systems that contain secret data. Yeah. I run a simple query. I get all of the files and folders with all the information about who has rights to them. I can write policies that alert me when things change. I can write policies that, in fact, in certain of the SaaS providers, can undo problems. As much as I like G Suite and some of the other things, one of the lingering problems is that people can, in fact, the default setting has been for quite some time, when you create something, it is saved with the permissions default anyone with the link. Okay,
So
This is stuff that keeps me up at night.
you're right. I think it's that, but that goes into something that like we start getting to access identity management becomes so important. Like if the network, the access to that traditional data center is no longer the control plane and the data is out in all these different SaaS services, how do we have a winning chance here, right? CISSP steps up and says, let me hook into all that over an API.
Exactly.
Now we've got policies. And then of course, it's like your access management, your Oktas of the world and such.
Correct.
And then those two plus permissioning is like kind of the winning combo.
Certainly. And CISSP covers a great deal of it. What I would throw in is what I was saying, there are two basic things we definitely have to do. The other is SIM. Being in the cloud does not relieve you of paying attention to your logs, creating use cases and alerts and rule sets that help you to sort out the billions and billions of bits of information that you get from logging. That is a critical feature of security, period. If you're not paying attention, you're in trouble. I think that I have had this discussion several times over my career about logging and what it means. There are two schools of thought here, is that you collect everything and you do your best to pay attention to it, or you collect nothing. And it's an interesting contradiction. I'm not recommending collecting nothing, by the way. But here's the interesting part. If I don't collect logs and something happens, from a security perspective, I'm ignorant. I can then say, oh, gee whiz, I learned that I have a problem, and now I can go address that problem. It's not very intelligent to be ignorant. I guess that's redundant. But my point is that you're not in the worst case scenario, which is you collect the logs, but you don't pay attention to them.
Right.
You've crossed the line into negligence because you have the data, you're just not doing anything with it. And so I think this idea of you get CloudTrail and there's all of these tools that are available in AWS, and the same is true in Azure and G Suite. The issue here is what are you doing with it? Can you pay attention closely? And there are some newer government things that have come out. In particular, the CMMC stuff is changing the world. We used to be able to write a letter that said, "I'm doing it right," and everybody took our word for it. Turns out that's actually not so much true as
turns out after like 100,000 breaches later, or it's like, oh, maybe this whole like people are just trust me, I got it isn't going to work for us.
Yeah, how about that? So again, it's even the government has said, all right, look, there's a standard of controls that you have to meet. CMMC, of course, is the maturity model that started out life as 800-171 under NIST, but has gained a foothold in the idea that we're not going to trust you to tell us you're doing it right anymore. That there is, in fact, a whole new set of jobs out there in information security for people to go out and certify that you're actually doing that correctly.
Yeah, I got some friends who do that, right? Anyone on the podcast needs help with that, let me know. But yeah,
very
it's
good.
Like, because that's exactly it. It's like, it's trust. Well, actually, it's not trust, just verify. We've just like skipped the trust part. We're like, let's just verify and certify. Yeah. And then we'll go from there.
I say this all the time. I have worked in some agile companies and with lots of younger folks who refer often or will say the phrase, "You should trust me, I'm a good guy," or I need to be trusted so I can do my job, or until I do something wrong, you should trust me. And my response is almost always the same: I'm sorry, but I'm not in the trust business. That's not what I do for a living. It's not that I'm accusing you of anything, but I still have to pay attention and gather real information so that if you get kidnapped and are forced to unlock a file at gunpoint, I can actually see that occurring and come to your rescue.
What a great analogy.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was going to say, so that is such a good thing about the idea that like our job is simply to say what can go, like that is the point of security. Well, actually take it back. You have three camps, right? You've got what you described as ignorance, negligence, or eyes wide open, working and doing your job properly. And I think, we'd find ourselves in the latter one. But this also goes back to what do we see the role of security being? Is the role of security being to say, let me fix it after the fact? Or is it to respond to a breach, or is it to prevent a breach, right? And if you're going to prevent the breach, then you need to neither be negligent nor ignorant. You have to be in that third category you're describing of just like,
Agreed.
we're going to trust you. Well, we're not going to trust you. We're going to give you the boundaries. And we're going to say, play inside these boundaries.
Exactly.
And if you're inside the boundaries, you're in the green zone. Play as hard and as long as you want. That's great. Ship as much code as you want. Stay within the boundaries. Do not go across the boundary. You cross the boundary, I'm showing up and we're having a conversation. Or you get a hard block that says no.
I agree. I also think that there's a fundamental important point of view around that. And that is, our job in security is not to define the box. Our job in security is to understand the business process and build a box that works around it. We are not the people that decide how things go. We are the people who decide how to make sure we can secure the way the business decides on how things should go.
Yeah.
And that draconian thing that we did for a while, especially, governments and regulations, they tend to be seen as this is the law and you're going to obey. At the end of the day, the beauty of technology is it changes all the time. It gives us more opportunity to do things where we can be inventive and secure things properly by exploring new methods all of the time.
It is that classic juxtaposition of like traditionally the office of no. Everything comes through security. We say, I don't think so. A, B, C, and D, we're not comfortable. As if anybody cared about our opinion, right? Now we could say, okay, you're trying to get here. You're trying to cross this river. Let me build you a bridge. And so you can cross it safely every time. Oh, you need to move really fast? Great. Let me do an inflatable lifeboat, get you across, and then we'll build a bridge for the second time you got to come over.
Exactly.
And I think, like, to your point, that's a far more sustainable, far more enabling way to do it. It's like all about enablement, decentralization, get people moving faster.
Plus, we also have to accept the fact that if you create controls that are viewed as draconian, smart people will find a way around them. And you will feel very secure because you've built something you're very proud of. But in fact, you will have deadbolts on your screen door.
Yeah, well put. I think that's really good analogy. I like to highlight to people. There's the original Jurassic Park. There's that classic line: "Life will find a way." We're talking about like how they've done this little thing with the tadpole eggs or whatever, and now they become dinosaurs. And it's like life will find a way was the great line. And I'm like, end users will find a way.
Absolutely.
Engineers will find a way. There needs to be like some security meme out there for that. But I think that's so true. So the job of security is like, do we say these smart people that we pay tons of money to get their work done, you can't do that? Or do we say, hey, here's how you do it safely?
That's right. And I think that there is an opportunity for us to continually examine what security actually means. You and I had a conversation previously before we started the podcast about the idea that there is a big difference between intrusion and breach. Yeah. And I had done some advisory for a security company a while back, and we kind of came up with the idea of describing their product well as saying that it isn't a question of whether people are going to get in. Someone could break in your house while you're out to dinner. That they can, pick the lock, they can break a window, they can knock down a door. The issue isn't the perimeter used to be the basic idea, right? Keep them out. You build a castle with a moat and several high walls, and that all seemed to work pretty well until we built helicopters, and then not so much. So the idea around reevaluating what our controls are, certainly, but also what it means to be breached. And I would argue, I'm sure that there will be people listening to your podcast and go, that guy's crazy. But I would argue that we can expect to be victims of intrusion, because the truth about computing is your machine is designed to say yes. Your controls are designed to keep the question from being asked. But if the question is asked of your computer in the properly formatted way, the answer is always yes. Can I have your entire database? If you ask in the right way and you're allowed to reach the place where you can ask the question, the answer is always yes. Your computer has no conscience. It doesn't understand the concept of no. The only other possible answer your computer can give you is, I didn't understand what you asked me. And so if we understand that, and we understand that there are bunch of enterprising, smart individuals out there trying to figure out how to get into things. The concept of that you are going to have intrusion should be not happily accepted and ignored, but rather accepted as a fact of life, that we have to pay attention to understanding when that occurs. And the closer we are to understanding when it occurs, the shorter our dwell time is, the quicker our responses are, etc. But intrusion in that case does not equal breach. Intrusion means somebody gets in. They get some malware in your box, and whether or not your malware tool does a quarantine or whatever the response method to that is, you still have been intruded. Somebody has gotten that code on your box. The issue is, what happens next? Can they take your valuable data, somebody else's valuable data, and get it out the door one way or another? Now, there's lots and lots of ways of doing that. I'll give you one that I think will set my example well. If you get a remote access Trojan on your machine, and the person at the other end of the C2 box at the command and control machine can watch you work, they don't need to exfil your data. They need to take screenshots of you working with it.
Yeah.
Okay, so what is exfiltration and what is breach? Well, that's breach because they now have your data. If your systems are set up in such a way that you can find the intrusion and prevent the exfiltration, you've prevented breach because you still control the data and nobody else has it. As I said, you'll have some listeners who go, "Yeah, that guy's crazy."
No, but so I think this is what the framing of the language that helps us win, because
Yes.
there are contracts. Sorry, so we get to the contractual and the legal part of that in a second because of the breach notification. But from a detection and response perspective, you're like, okay, what are we trying to do? Are we trying to say we had 10,000 bits of noise come from the internet and hit our WAF, but don't worry, the WAF took care of it? I'm like, okay, that's effectively a useless dashboard or report. Like, they don't, under the rare circumstance, do we need this for like context or maybe trend analysis? But like, really, it's like, okay, what's important and did it leave? If it didn't leave, great. And I think people in this space would do really well to steal from the MITRE ATT&CK framework, or the MITRE ATT&CK framework is a good one, and say, okay, start on the exfiltration side, like as you were talking about, let's prevent the breach and then walk our way backwards. And same with, like, we look at removing vulnerabilities or hardening our systems. It's like, prioritize the ones that if were exploited would lead directly to a breach, and then move on to the ones that if they were chained together would lead to a breach. But I like this idea of like starting there and then like working our way out. Because yeah, it'd be great to prevent all the intrusions, but the impact is on the breach when they take
Absolutely.
the data.
That's right. Well, this was always the promise of data leakage protection technologies.
DLP, that's been a super success. Everyone loves it.
Well, the idea is a good one. I mean, in concept, it's a great idea that you can identify those things that shouldn't leave your system. And that if you can tag them in such a way that you can get an automated response to an attempt to exfil that data, you don't lose it. You don't have an actual breach. The problem with that is it's still a work in progress. It works on a bunch of stuff. It works on easy to understand data like a social security number. You can write a DLP regular expression that says anything that has a social security number should never leave my prem in email in clear text. And those things work. They do. It gets a little weirder when you get into other types of data. Can you identify everything that is HIPAA data? Well, how would your DLP be able to recognize an X-ray?
Yeah, there you go.
That's a good one. I'd like to see that. So it's still about understanding your data well enough to be able to apply, call it metadata, call it file naming convention, call it some kind of a label that allows you to understand what you actually have. Which is why if you look at the SANS security controls and all the basic framework information, the first item is always inventory. Know what you have, label that so you can understand it. Design your controls around what you actually have to protect. So I think this idea that we're smarter, better, faster, stronger is true, but it doesn't mean that the bad guys haven't figured that out too. People who want your data are going to come up with a new and interesting way to do it. I think a great example of that is firewall technology. We've got great firewall technology now. The old method of I'm going to break into, I'm going to kick down your firewall and I'm going to break into your systems and I'm going to ride off into the sunset with your stuff. It's become so good. The majority of people who are trying to get your data have given up on that idea. They're not attacking that anymore. They send an email to an unsuspecting user that says, gee whiz, can I have your password? Or, gee, can I have your database? Or can I have your credit card information? I saw one the other day, a good friend of mine, a guy named Bob Zinga, who is a commander in the Navy Reserve and works in their security, information security stuff. He passed on something that was a social engineering attack that asked people, if you had as much money as equal to your social security number, how rich would you be?
Click here to find out.
And people responded with a dollar sign in front of their social security number. Oh. Yikes. Yikes. Okay, so did they have to kick down the firewall? Did they have to breach something to get this information? No, they just asked politely.
My God, that's like the I love you thing from back in the day. It's just come on, guys. But yeah, that comes back to it. It's like the adversary is going to go for what works. Kicking down a firewall doesn't work. Let's go for the human. That works. And I think this is why, okay, replying back with the data, that's a hard one to train out of people. Right. But there are things that we can be doing with better access, identity access management controls. I think that's a big one because that's the next thing, right? Either the attacker's going to drop a payload, they're going to steal your credentials, or just ask for the data. But anyway.
I think this is why user training has reached such an important level. And we all talk about our security awareness programs and in particular, anyone who's not training their users to recognize phishing emails had better get on it. The vast majority of data breaches are beginning with an email to somebody who has rights to stuff and doesn't know any better than to respond back. How difficult is it to recognize the Nigerian prince anymore? I'm looting my company's treasury and I want to park the money in your bank account. Will you give me your social and your bank account? Yeah. No. Okay. Most people have seen that one enough. But you know what? That still works. It still works. And in some ridiculous forms. On the other hand, there's much more sophisticated things we've seen. Spear phishing and spoofing the CEO who puts pressure on the CFO. I've got this deal I'm finishing right now. I'm about to get on an airplane, but I want you to send $1 million to this wire transfer because if you don't, we're going to lose this deal. That has also worked.
It does. And I've also responded to companies when they ask for help, as this was my job at one point. They're like, something went wrong. What happened? We get under there and we start taking a look and it's like the attacker. So there's the person they want money for. There's the person who's going to do the wire transfer and all of this. And the attacker gets into the mailbox. The guy's credentials get stolen. The guy gets into the mailbox. The attacker looks and sees that there was a corresponding thread between company A and company B. And they were going to, at some point, transfer money between each other. So the attacker then just sends over an email impersonating company B and says, hey, Mary, following up on that email, or hey, John, following up on that email, I think we're ready for the transfer now. Please feel free to send it to this routing number, bop, bop. And the guy says, okay, I thought it was a week earlier than I thought, but what's changed? And there's this whole email narrative back and forth. That's right. And then only because company A, the guy who got breached, called company B, went out of band and said, hey, just checking the routing number here for this transfer. Are we good to go? Company B's like, what are you talking about? Wasn't talking to you at all. Exactly. And the company had registered a domain that was similar to company B, did the whole classic thing, forward, reply back, similar name, the whole bit, and did a good job. And company A was none the wiser till the very end.
You've just made my point exactly. That the human element, the idea that you go out of band, you pick up the phone, you, as we like to say, unass your chair and go talk to somebody and say, did you really want me to do this? If you get the human being to act as a security control, at the end of the day, you still have a smarter being, or at least capability of being a smarter being than a computer that can fall only what it's been programmed to do. This is something that the promise of artificial intelligence is out there
We're not there
somewhere,
yet. Yes.
but it's not going to think for us. And which is why my point is around user training is that it doesn't have to be this uncomfortable, unpleasant, tedious process where people will scroll to the bottom and click next. And we recognize that they're doing this because in many of the video programs that I've seen and actually pushed out to users, there's a scroll bar that has to get all the way across underneath the slide before you can click next. It's not that they're paying attention. They're multitasking. They're reading their mail and they go, oh, look, the bar's almost there. Okay, next. And then they go back to what they were doing. The issue here is that you have an effective training program. Now, one of my favorite examples of these are, if you get a ticket in California, they allow you to go to traffic school to get the ticket taken off your record. If you were to go to the traditional traffic school of the early 50s and 60s when they first did this program, there was a highway patrolman or a police officer of some kind who was probably on a medical leave, who couldn't be on the street, and he didn't want to be there any more than you did. And he droned on with, this is the law you broke, or here's a film of somebody dying in a wreck. So you had these really terrible programs. As that whole process has matured over time, there are comedy stand-up people that are giving traffic school because they get the details they need to teach people, but they give it to them in a way that can be consumed by the person they're trying to train. And I think there's a lot of synergy there for what we have to do is we have to keep reimagining our programs and addressing things that change, because at the end of the day, the truth of the matter is it's still the human beings that are the most important target for attackers. The systems have gotten mature. The things that we do to protect us are pretty good. If we can catch the people up, I think we're going to do a lot better.
I think that's a great thing. And that whole sense of just like enabling and training, and we've spent so much time and energy and money in the people who actually run the company. Shouldn't security also focus accordingly there, and helping make people better and smarter and stronger in the same way we do with technology?
Absolutely.
I think that's a really, really great point. One of the other things that you and I had talked about, and I just wanted to reiterate this in the podcast so everyone had a chance to hear this, was a simple rule of go out of band. And yep. I just didn't want to lose this moment to highlight that. Like such a simple piece of training, which is if you get an email that comes in, actually, I'm not going to steal your thunder. Why don't you explain your
quite all right. Yeah, it is. It's not PhD level material. The basic idea of out of band means if you receive a communication in one form, whether that's email or FTP or could be a telegram for that matter, you use a second infrastructure out of band from the original contact to do validation. So if you get an email from your CEO saying, I need you to send $10 million wire transfer, you don't email him back. You pick up the phone and you call him. You go out of band from email. If the email says, I'm getting on an airplane and you can't call me, this is a huge red flag. This is you can't go out of band. So do the attackers understand that defense by going out of band is also important? Of course they do, and which is why you see this added to phishing messages. You can't call me. Okay, then I'm not doing this. Or I'm going to go to somebody else and say, I need a two-man rule to approve these kind of things. The idea of out of band too is very interesting in terms of if you receive something on a system that you're not sure is as secure as another system, go to the more secure system. Great example. We all know that malware can reside in lots of different kinds of things. People used to say, PDFs are portable document format. You can't do it. Yeah, okay, so there's lots of malware that can be delivered in those things. If you get something that you don't recognize, the sender, it's unexpected, there's a sense of urgency, all of those kind of flags that this may be something goofy, and you feel compelled to open it on your cell phone, if it's business, hold off. get into a more secure system. If your laptop or your Windows or your Mac or your Linux box or whatever that is a better choice than a mobile device, which we know are notoriously easy to break, then do it there. Is that technically out of band? It's the same medium.
It's certainly moving to a more defensible position.
Exactly. That's right.
Yeah. But I like that idea. If you get an email, verify with text. You get a text, pick up the phone. You get a phone call, Slack them. Right? Just do something a little different to verify.
Exactly.
We all have more than one way of reaching yourselves. And if you don't, fix that. That's not very defensible.
That's why I keep carrier pigeons at the house.
Between smoke signals and carrier pigeons, I think we'll be all set.
Right.
Well, Bob, I got like one more topic I want to hit. I've
Sure.
really enjoyed our time together before we wrap up today. And I think this may be one of the more important ones we have is talking about executive security messaging, right? We can talk about how we've talked about these incredible things that people can start implementing immediately. But one of the things that I've seen is that we see a lot of high growth companies who are chasing the growth metric and they're chasing the this metric or that metric, which is perfectly fine. But they may be incurring more security debt than they realize, or they may have more risk on the table than they're paying attention to. Agreed. So what were some of your thoughts around how is it that you do executive security messaging well and in leading a high growth startup or a high growth company, I should say, kind of where does one couch that conversation and how does one have an effective conversation to that audience?
Certainly. So I'll begin with the basic concept of one of our primary jobs in information security. In fact, the overarching concept of our job in information security is risk management. Mm-hmm. The idea is if they want to grow fast, that's great. Go get it. Sell like crazy, build your company. Those are all valuable goals for a company. They have one thing in common. They are about finance. They are about dollars and cents, and they are about ROI and the money that they're spending to get things done. In information security, we have this long-standing, I wouldn't call it a failing. I would say it's something we all need to adjust to. And there is a real concerted effort to do what I'm talking about, so I won't delay any longer. What I'm talking about is fair methodology of risk. So financial assessment of information risk, which means when we do risk assessments, and in particular when we're talking to senior leadership and board of directors, we don't want to go in and say, I have a chart that shows you this risk is a 5. And they'll look at us and go, what's a 5?
Right.
And we have to then take some kind of analogy that we believe that they can understand and say, well, 5 is you should be really, really scared. And a 4 is you should only be really scared. And a 3 is you should be scared, but it's not that big a deal. This is not business language. This is not what business leadership wants to hear from us. So fair methodology is the basic idea that you do your risk assessments in terms of dollars and cents. The annualized loss expectancy is, we can use the standard, which has been the training method for everybody to get their brain wrapped around this. We have a warehouse. We know that at one point every 10 years, we're going to have a fire. And in that fire, we are going to lose $1 million worth of our inventory and the cost of the building. Okay. If I put in the sprinkler system and it costs me, remember we're talking a 10-year period, more than $100,000 a year to do that, I shouldn't put in the fire extinguishing system because it costs more than the loss.
Right.
However, if I'm going to lose $1 million in that fire and the entire cost over that 10-year period is $100,000, of course I'm going to put in the fire suppression system. Mm-hmm. I don't need to be a security expert to understand the controls, the risk in terms of what does it technically mean. I can speak to a board of directors or a senior leadership group and say, if this thing happens, you will lose this much money. The protection to keep that thing from happening costs this much money. And they get to do a financial analysis that says, if it's going to cost me $10 million over a period of 10 years, That's an ALE of $1 million, the annualized lost expectancy. And my cost is 1/10 of that annualized loss, then it should make some financial sense to spend that money. This is why we have car insurance, right? This is, if I run into something in my car, it's going to cost me $10,000 to fix it, and my insurance costs me $300 a year. Okay, then I should probably buy the insurance, right?
I love that. Yeah.
And so that in terms of high growth companies or any other companies, from an information security professional perspective, we can't talk to them about what we know. We have to talk to them in the language of business. And if we take our risk assessments and make them in financial terms, we can get through to them. We can say, this is an easy business decision to make. You're going to lose 10 million and it'll cost you $5 to stop it. Mm-hmm. If they don't get that, they probably shouldn't be running the business they are.
Right, exactly. But I think the issue kind of more resides at the moment with the security community, not the executive community.
Absolutely. No, it's up to us to talk to them in their language, not to teach them what we mean.
That's what they hire us for.
This is a failing. I've seen this. Right, exactly. We're supposed to know. When I always say this too, it's that when you go to your doctor, if he starts talking to you about the Latin description of what's wrong with you, does that help you?
That's a great analogy.
Maybe, yeah. But at the end of the day, there's the old joke. A guy goes to the doctor and he says, "Doc, it hurts when I touch here, touch here, touch here, touch here," and the doctor looks at him and says, "Dude, you got a broken finger." Mm. You have to set it into terms that the consumer understands. And because we, in information security, we love our lingo, we love our tech, we love our expertise, we love to, we have all of this great knowledge that we spend all this time and effort building up. At the end of the day, they don't care at all. They hired us to do what we do because we're good at it. And that's really as far as it goes. So when we can talk to them in their language about the things that we need to do a better job securing them, in hyper growth companies where they're saying, well, I need to see ROI. Okay, so ROI is a simple thing the day that the breach happens. If it never happens, then there's no ROI. It's a difficult conversation to have. So it still only has to be about financial risk to get through to them.
Yeah, and maybe that's one of the good things that's happening with the some of the privacy legislation we've seen come out with CCPA and GDPR. So there's been a very clear dollar per record. I mean, PCI has been doing it for a while, but it's been so small and so fuzzy for so long. But like CCPA was just like, this is what you're going to get, and then there's a civil action and your civil range looks like this. So you could pretty much set up a little spreadsheet and be like, we have these many records from California residents. Yep. This is what the average cost per record would be. Okay, we now have a sum total. This is like the security liability that we're preventing a breach would cost, a breach of this data would cost us X. Cool. So we have a number.
And I think there's one other formula that I should add to kind of clarify my point a little more, which is, let's assume we're talking data breach, which is what scares most of us in our business, is that we leak something that belongs to somebody else. And there's first of all, there's the cost of dealing with the circus of running around with your hair on fire, trying to figure out what happened, bringing in people whose job it is to do communications and legal review and forensics, and just the handling cost is expensive. And that's day one or day three. Mm-hmm. By the time you get to reputational risk and loss of potential customers or loss of current customers, regulatory fines, you start adding up, this number gets way bigger in terms of what it costs you to protect that data, or to at least recognize that somebody's attacking trying to get that data. And this is the whole idea of doing proper risk management, in that you say, look, if the bad day happens, day one, we're going to lose an additional, $80,000, $90,000 in people time. On day two, when we have to publicly disclose, our stock price is going to drop by 15%. Okay, how much is your stock worth? Then you can figure out a number there. Mm-hmm. On day 5, when our customer whose data we lost begins to sue us, the lawyers start, they drop the meter on their taxi and off they go at $650 an hour. Mm-hmm. Then eventually the government piles on and says, you had a responsibility to pick these things up and pay attention, and here's your fine. At what point does that in terms of time and effort and cost and reputational loss and the destruction of your business, at what point does that outweigh the control that you were trying to put in place and convince somebody to give you the money for? That's the point of this exercise, is that you have to talk about, at the end of the day, it's kind of like insurance. You do something to keep something else from happening, or to put you in position to deal with it when it does happen. And if you talk to them in terms of, you talk to people who are making the decisions, especially from a financial perspective, it's not about the technology. It's not about, well, a hacker could come in through port 443 over.
Exactly.
Stop. They don't want to hear that.
DNS tunneling is not an executive conversation. Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of completes my point there.
No, but I think that's an incredible point that I hope everyone listening hears that. It's like, there are methodologies. You don't have to rewrite the book on this. Like, it does exist. Steal what works, right? Great artists steal. And then there is a real dollar cost and have that conversation. And so there's going to be this investment conversation that needs to happen, which is in their language, not ours. I think those are all incredible takeaways. Thank you, Bob. Now,
my pleasure.
Unfortunately, we're coming towards the end of the time here. I mean, we just talk for hours on this stuff. So, we may have to do a part 2 on this later down the road.
There you go.
Bob, if I just ask you, like, if people want to connect with you, if people want to learn more, what's the best way to reach out for you and connect with you offline?
I'm on LinkedIn. I tend to pay attention to LinkedIn. I have in my past, I have a Facebook account and those things, but honestly, I don't pay much attention to that. LinkedIn, I think, is a great way to reach me professionally. I'm approaching the 1,000 connections and stuff. So I'm committed to keeping up with that. I generally, in a situation like this, I'm not going to give out my work or even my personal email.
I think that's a very good idea.
Although I suppose if I did, I could give you my social at the same time. So
it would make it very convenient for our listeners to connect with you. As a matter of fact, they'll take your whole identity at the same time.
Yeah, you can find me at my formal name is Robert, but all my friends call me Bob. So I'm hoping I'm making some friends on your podcast, and they can all look at me as Bob as well.
Perfect. And we'll put a link to your profile in the show notes here. But Bob, I just want to, again, thank you for your time. This has been an excellent conversation. And with that, I will ask all the listeners who are listening to this, please don't forget to subscribe, give us an honest review on whichever platform you're listening to. It helps out tremendously. And then, of course, jump over to LinkedIn and send Bob some love as well. Okay.
Thank you so much, Connor. You do a great job with this podcast.
Thank you so much. Until next time.